Well, I'm really very much looking forward to this session because it weaves storytelling into the topics about science that are tough to communicate. And storytelling is, as I said, what I'm all about. I'm teaching a class, in fact, this semester to students on the storytelling of sustainability in science. Some of it comes very, very easily, and some of it is a real struggle. So over the course of these days here, we have sessions that illuminate areas of science communication that are currently enjoying, quotes, extensive media coverage, but that also tend to be polarizing. Unfortunately, that's what grabs the ratings in so many parts of the media ecosystem. First is on human genome editing. So Cornelia Dean, who was a girl singer in a rock band. What was the name of your rock band?
Well, that's a good question. The short answer is Dirty Filthy Basement, because we practice Dirty Filthy Basement.
We don't need to know more.
All right, that's it.
I mean, about that name, but go ahead.
We practice in a Dirty Filthy Basement,
okay, well,
and Dirty Filthy Basement occurs in a Rolling Stones song that we do. So.
She also happens to be a science writer, former science editor of the New York Times, and she's going to set the stage on this human gene editing. Matt Porteous is an associate professor of pediatrics at a place called Stanford University. His credentials are amazing because I understand you taught skiing at Vail between your undergrad and med school. I'm glad you came down the mountain standing up. That's better that way. And you'll explain the specific aspects of human gene editing that are most important to communicate. And Dietram Schäufele, a professor of science communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, someone who should not spend time in Las Vegas because of his questionable bets during the presidential campaign, will nonetheless discuss the communication research that can help practitioners do a more effective job of communicating about this area of science. And before we go any further, Dietram, we should thank you again for helping to make so much of this possible here today and so much of what's going on. Corey, the story's yours.
Okay, so ever since I was invited to participate in this panel on the subject of gene editing, which was months ago, I've been sort of collecting examples from science, nature, from the public press about activities that are going on in this realm of research. And there are a lot of them. There's a lot of reports coming out of China, and I don't know if we actually can say, you guys would know better than I would, whether we have reliable information about what's being done there, but there's activity there. There were just in recent months reports in Nature and Science on gene editing to see how cells develop in the embryo, and another one to correct a defect, an inherited defect involving the use of a donated egg and sperm from a man who has the defect. And that work was done in Oregon. And also, someone has invented, using these gene editing techniques, a way of treating your own skin so that you can have it implanted, you can have some of your own skin altered and implanted in your body such that it glows depending on what your glucose level is, which would be a way to help everybody who has to test their blood if they have diabetes. But anyway, so there's a whole lot of activity, but this story is difficult to cover, and I think it's difficult for us as a society to deal with. In the first place, obviously, the work is complex, and complex stories are hard to tell, or can be very hard to tell. It can be hard to write an engaging narrative about a topic that is technically complex. And our difficulty doing that can lead science writers down byways that it turns out it's not good for us to go down. Also, the subject matter is, I would say, fraught, because this kind of work with germline gene editing has a lot to say about what is human nature, what does it mean to be human, who are we in the condition of the universe, where do we fit, and so on. And especially in our country, where we have a tremendous public respect and admiration for science, but we also have a very substantial portion of citizens who believe that science and technology is moving too fast, and it is moving, as a field, the enterprise is moving with insufficient attention paid to moral and philosophical issues. And this is a prime example of that kind of story. Plus, we're living, as everybody knows, in a highly polarized political environment in which people are probably divided more than they have been in the past. We heard some of that information today. And that makes it hard to have a kind of conversation in society about how this technology should be used and for what purpose. And that is interesting to me because a couple of years ago there was a big, it's called the Organizing Committee for the International Summit on Human Genome Editing. And this was an international effort involving the National Academy, the Royal Society, the Chinese equivalent of the National Academy, and so on. And the idea was to kind of create a sort of framework for doing this kind of work. And this committee put out a report in December of 2015, and they had a lot of suggestions, but the one that struck me the most powerfully was the committee's assertion that it would be irresponsible to proceed with this work. That was their language. It would be irresponsible to proceed unless there was what they called a broad societal consensus about the appropriateness of this work and its proposed applications. And I don't see how, well, it doesn't matter what I think. This organization said, we need to have a wider discussion, and that they had a laundry list of people who should be participating, including biomedical scientists, social scientists, ethicists, healthcare providers, patients and families, people with disabilities, policymakers, regulators, research funders, faith leaders, industry, members of the general public, and public citizen advocates. And I thought myself that was a really good idea, and how we could manage to pull those kinds of conversations together in our country today, I have no idea. But that, I think that's what is needed. Germline human genetic engineering is one of a number of topics that, in my opinion, there needs to be broader societal buy-in for these things. People often cite, I'm sure everybody here knows about the Asilomar conference that occurred when recombinant DNA technology first came on the scene, and the microbiologists gathered at the conference center in Asilomar and declared a moratorium, and eventually came up with rules that led us to what we have today, recombinant DNA advisory committees and so on. And at the time, I thought that was really admirable and interesting and so on. But what you're hearing a lot of people say today is they don't like the Asilomar approach. They don't like the idea of some kind of bunch of elite people getting into a room somewhere and emerging at some point with what they think should happen. And the rest of us saying, oh, all right. So, and I kind of agree with that opinion. My problem is I don't know how we're going to get to the kind of broader conversation that we need to have. And I just want to close by saying this is, I think, human germline gene editing, I think, is probably the most prominent subject of this nature, and probably the one that will cause the most angst in the minds of the most people. But there are many others. One of them is geoengineering, which you may have heard of, which is the idea of altering Earth's atmosphere to reduce the effects of greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, tuning Earth's climate. And so who decides when it's time to do that? Who decides what the goal of it is? Who decides what's an acceptable ill effect? That kind of thing. Should we have autonomous battlefield robots? We already have battlefield robots, but they're controlled by humans. What about having battlefield robots that make their own decisions? Or what about artificial intelligence applications generally? I think these are things that should be the subject of a wider societal conversation, which means there should be wider coverage of them in the media, but because they're difficult to cover and hard to get your mind around if you're a lay journalist, I don't know how much of that we're going to have, and also I don't know how in our current political situation we can have the requisite discussion. But I think it's the research community, I would say, that needs to reach out to the wider society and try to get this kind of conversation going. I'd love to hear what anybody has to think about all that.
Which we will do.